the value that we place on each of these principles is going to be determined by our values. So values determine what we value. And that's quite compelling. And I think also we're becoming as a society much more conscientious and aware of the power of values. In fact, they're being infused in nearly every aspect of our life. When we think about, purchasing a Patagonia vest, like it goes beyond the vest. It's about the values that underpin that purchase. When we might deploy capital to or buy into Bitcoin, it's because of the values that underpin that, right? For those that don't know, the Great Wealth Transfer is basically a great transfer of wealth from one generation to the next. And the new stat as of last month in December was that $105 trillion is going to pass hands from one generation to the next by 2048.
Wow.
$105 trillion. So
that's 10% of global wealth.
Wild.
Yeah.
Absolutely wild.
So that's by what date? Sorry?
2048.
2048. Okay,
Yep.
so we're looking at the next 20 odd years.
Yeah. And that's haircutted even, and that's taking out money that goes to charity. Mm-hmm. So those are just to the next generation.
Jennifer Wines has spent her whole career in private wealth management in the US at institutions like Goldman Sachs, Fidelity, and JP Morgan. In 2022, she launched her own consulting company called Invisible Wealth and published a book of the same name, capturing the same ethos, focusing on a holistic approach to the concept of wealth for her clients. This new approach, she argues, is indicative of an entire generational shift along with a whole new set of values for investing. Money alone is no longer the sole objective of wealth, but rather one of 5 pillars existing in a broader framework, encompassing also health, knowledge, time, and relationships. A lot of the issues caused in the world today are from society's focus on money and financial wealth. This is a very interesting discussion around how society's values are shifting with a focus to broader, more enriching wealth. This chat serves to re-examine what is wealth and what it means to many of us today. So Jen, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. It's always hard for people to get to this part of Switzerland, but really grateful for you making the effort.
It was gorgeous. A nice ride in from Zurich along the water. Thank you for having me.
Lovely. So look, we're here to talk about wealth today. And I think, there's a lot that's been explored about wealth and obviously the focus of the world. And one of the things that we see as one of the core problems of the world is people chasing financial wealth and, being a bit short-term minded about that. And I think that does lead to some issues. It can lead to corruption in government and, all these types of things. But before we get too into that, maybe it would be good for the audience to have an understanding of the context, sort of where you came from. You obviously worked in some of the biggest Wall Street wealth managers. What was it that finally got you to the point of saying, okay, this is what I'm doing. I'm on a mission.
Yeah, it's a great question and one that I've clearly thought a lot about for many, many years. And it's a good question to kick us off because it provides me the opportunity to share the lens through which I'm approaching the topic. And I'm going to start a little personal just because I think it's helpful and it's context relevant. So growing up, I've lived on different parts of the wealth spectrum, meaning that there were times growing up where I saw my mom putting quarters, nickels, dimes into the gas pump, right, just to get me to school and her to work. And so that was one experience. And then I've also been on the other side of the wealth spectrum where there were times growing up where I vacationed on very large boats and things like this. And so I think it's this spectrum of experiences that have really helped to inform my concept and relationship with wealth. So that's personal. Then on the professional side, as you've mentioned, I've been in the world of wealth for the entirety of my career. Started at Goldman, was at JP Morgan Private Bank for a while, most recently Fidelity Private Wealth Management. I think that's when our roads crossed when I was at Fidelity. And Fidelity was great, right? And it was so much fun, lovely institution. But as I was in the wealth advisor seat, I started to notice that mindsets were shifting. Mindsets were shifting with my clients and also within myself, right? And so people were starting to kind of revisit and redefine what wealth is. And this theme became omnipresent for me, really permeated a lot of the conversations. And so it was through these 1,000 client conversations that, again, I started to notice that something is happening here. And all the while, particularly during COVID, I think that changed a lot for people. It opened the doors to conversations that just weren't on the table in times past as it relates to, what am I doing with work? What am I doing with my life? I have this underlying health condition. My kid's driving me nuts because we're in the same house, 24/7. So you have all of these things bubble up and conversations become a lot more personal. And so I think it was through this observation that I noticed that things were shifting. And for me, I wanted to leave the advisor seat so that I could fully dedicate myself to kind of researching this trend and to researching, the axioms of wealth, and more specifically asking, like, what is wealth, both practically and philosophically.
That's amazing. Yeah. And obviously, the example you gave of the sort of the laundromat picture versus this, I imagine, super yacht picture as the sort of direct comparison. Obviously, we're once again talking about financial wealth. And I think you broke it down very nicely in your book into 5 key pillars. Do you want to maybe just walk us through those 5 key pillars of wealth, and then we can maybe just jump into a few of them?
Sure. So before I do that, I'll just give some context there too as to why I created these 5 pillars. And you might enjoy this because it has to do with where you started your life. So you were born in England, right? As was the word wealth. So the word wealth came into our lexicon mid-13th century from England. And it was born from the root well, W-E-L-E or W-E-A-L, depending on the source that you look at. So the word wealth found its definitional roots in health and well-being. So wealth originally meant health, well-being, and happiness. But what happened is over time, with the increased sophistication of money and the increased sophistication of economies over time, wealth ended up becoming synonymous with an abundance of money and material possessions. So there's this evolution that's happened. So we've gone from wealth being health and well-being to wealth being synonymous with money. And so now I think the invitation is on the table for us to kind of revisit and reconceptualize what wealth is. And so due to technological advancements and societal shifts, I'll say that. So we have this rare opportunity to revisit and redefine wealth. And what I put in the book is wealth is actually when you have an abundance of what you value. So the question then becomes, what are you valuing and why? So really it's inviting in an invitation to think about, okay, what do I value and why? And there are many different assets in life. We are very accustomed to thinking about assets in the wealth context as it relates to money, but there's other assets. And so that's the backdrop for the 5 principles, which all present a group of assets that we go through our life wanting to attain more of, albeit perhaps at different points in times in our lives. So maybe I can walk through the 5 principles so we all know what I'm talking about. So the first one, as you'd imagine, is money and investment. The second is health and quality of life. The third is knowledge, status, influence. The fourth is time, energy, and experiences. And the fifth, last but absolutely not least, is relationship with self and others. Right? So those are the 5 principles. Those are the groups of assets that I put forth. What's your response in hearing those? Does that make sense to you? Is there anything you'd add or take away?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, they do have, I was trying to think about it as I was thinking about the conversation we'd likely have.
Yeah.
There's probably a prioritization within that. If you don't have health, you don't care about anything else. You just care about getting healthy again.
Right.
And I would say, once you've got health covered, I think you can be fairly myopic, depending on your personality type, to your point about values. So, the question I wanted to ask you is, when you're doing these sort of conversations with 1,000 wealthy people, what is it that's coming out on top? Obviously, I think we'd all agree that if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. So that's probably number one. But maybe I'm wrong on that, and tell me. But yeah, I'd love to hear what's sort of changing in terms of the focus, because we did grow up in, I'm probably a generation ahead of you, but we grew up in a period where wealth was the focus. Grew up in the 80s. All the movies were about Wall Street, and that's how I ended up in investment banking. You know, that's where the money is. Yep. If you want to make money, that's where you want to be focused. Right. So, that was a really big part of my cultural upbringing. So I think it it does tend to change within generational shifts, and we should talk about that. But yeah, I'd love to hear what people tell you.
Yeah, so you mentioned health, right? Is kind of foundational to the wealth conversation. And again, that goes back to the etymology of health, which is interesting. And I agree with you. I think when you're 16, you kind of take health for granted, right? So when you're 16, you might think, I don't know, relationships are your priority, or maybe it's knowledge because you're thinking about college coming up, these types of things. So again, the concept of wealth, it's subjective, right? Because it's predicated on what do you value, and value is subjective. And it's also dynamic in the sense that it changes over time. So that's why it's interesting for this wealth conversation is always dynamic, because each person is kind of coming to the table or coming to the conversation viewing wealth through their own complex matrix of being. And so we're each approaching this conversation through our own complex matrix of being, meaning that today, and part of the reason why I left the advisor seat is because I started to value different things above others. So there was a reprioritization. So in effect, I deprioritized money and investment, so to speak, to optimize for for me, freedom was a big catalyst for that. But I wanted to be able to spend my time learning things that I really wanted to know, not things that I thought I needed to know because society said that's what I needed to know. So it was really born from a curiosity for me personally to reprioritize those 5 principles. Now, when we look at those 5 principles, and this is something that I go through with clients these days, is that we can look at these assets, right? So say money and investment, health and quality of life, knowledge, status, influence, time, energy, experiences, and relationship with self and others. And the value that we place on each of these principles is going to be determined by our values. So values determine what we value. And that's quite compelling. And I think also we're becoming, as a society, much more conscientious and aware of the power of values. In fact, they're being infused in nearly every aspect of our life. When we think about purchasing a Patagonia vest, like it goes beyond the vest. It's about the values that underpin that purchase. When we might deploy capital to or buy into Bitcoin, it's because of the values that underpin that, right? So we're getting really...
Not with everyone.
Not with everyone. Fair.
Number go up is a big thing with Bitcoin as well.
That's true. Yeah. So, but I think that this concept of values is really inviting us to kind of reconceptualize again what we value, and by extension, what our concept of wealth is.
I guess when you talk about this and you talk about your clients, do we need to see a shift? Because part of the C's group is C's Bank, and it's very similar to the wealth platforms that you used to work on. It's a private bank here in Switzerland, and do we need to see a shift of the model where your relationship manager becomes almost your psychiatrist and is saying, look, these are the things that you care about. This is these are the various channels that we can help you optimize, and it becomes almost like a family office sort of advisory setup where, it's not just the financial aspect. It's the health, the knowledge, the education, helping your kids get into the right schools, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you see that evolving? Like, we're right at the starting point right now, but to your point, I think questions are coming around, well, I don't necessarily care about having loads of money. I have enough money to do what I need to do, but I don't need to be a billionaire. Right. So I guess we're having that conversation being started by clients and this global awareness around value focus, as you say. So how does that change? How does it evolve? Are you seeing it evolve already in some of these wealth managers?
For sure. So it's a great question because, of course, my research into the evolution of wealth, by extension, that impacts the evolution of wealth management, right? Because, of course, if people are starting to think about wealth in different ways, well, then their expectation as to what wealth management also changes as a consequence. And so I think that within the wealth management arena, entities are starting to honor both sides of the proverbial coin, meaning that they're wanting to address the quantitative aspect of the conversation as well as the qualitative, right? And how the two interplay together. I think that's critically important if we want to talk holistic wealth rather. And we see this reflected back to us, this cultural and societal shift By virtue of like the branding that a lot of these entities are kind of putting forth now. A lot of the talks that I've done over the past year and a half have been relating to, wealth beyond money. That's often a tagline. And so there's definitely an interest and an intrigue. And so again, as we reconceptualize wealth, we by extension reconceptualize wealth management, which is inviting a more holistic, multidimensional interpretation of what that engagement looks like. And people are finding a lot of utility in talking about wealth in a more expansive way because as we're able to reconceptualize what work is, what our day today looks like, how our families are arranged, how our friends are arranged, there's so much optionality at the table that sometimes it helps to just talk that through with someone whom you trust and who also knows what your financial situation is. So it's a really elegant follow-on to the money and investment conversation.
If we think about this, I mean, is this just really a rich person's problem? You get to be able to look at this and say, well, I've got enough money now, so I don't need to worry about feeding my family, so I can focus on these other things. What do we think about the people that are still at the point where they're, having to scrape by, work 2 jobs? How should they be thinking differently to make sure that they're getting this balance in their life?
I think it's the same conversation. You're just playing with different elements, I guess. It's the same conversation. So, for example, and as you mentioned earlier, which is a really great point, health for many is first and foremost. So if someone is, say, not in the financial position that they might want to, well, by all means, focus on health, get healthy, feel strong, feel fit, because oftentimes assets beget assets, meaning that when you attain one asset, it tends to support the acquisition of another asset. So if you attain and optimize your health and research supports, then usually you're going to attain and optimize your financial wealth too. So it's just a matter of what do you want to focus on first and why. Similarly, if you focus on relationships, that's going to help fortify your mental health because you have great relationships. So a lot of times we focus on, say, which of the 5 principles we should be focusing on at a certain point in time. And oftentimes the default is money, which I completely understand. I'm not here to negate money's importance in our life by all not at all. But the point is that there's other attributes that you can focus on, other assets that are going to help to support the acquisition of money. Another example would be knowledge, right? What knowledge are you going to accumulate these days? What has practical utility today that you can then wield for productive economic power? So I think people, regardless of your situation, can take these components and think through what they want to solve for first and the follow-on implications of that to help to lead a wealthier, richer life.
Yeah. When I was looking at your principles, I was thinking, okay, if I was Jennifer and writing this book, how would I have come up with these principles? And, maybe it's something related to the Maslow hierarchical need structure, and you could look at that and say, okay, these are the needs of a human, and therefore these are the requirements for a wealthy, happy well-being, as you said, where it originally came from. But one thing I was just thinking as we were talking just then is if you don't have the wealth to sort of pull you out of that stressed focus to make money to feed your family, the one thing that I think probably could be useful is a mindset shift, right? And a positive mindset versus someone with a negative mindset. And have you thought about including that, or does that somehow fit within the principles?
And I'm so glad you mentioned this. So thank you. You're absolutely right. It's a mindset shift. And that's one thing that I talk about in the health and quality of life chapter of Invisible Wealth, that we're reconceptualizing health. So in times past, we've typically thought about health as, your physical health. And, basically whatever you saw, that meant if you're thin, oh, yeah, you're healthy. But these days, it's much more. We're much more interested in the invisible or the intangible attributes of health, i.e. mental health, spiritual health, these types of things. And what's fascinating too is that we have technology helping us to bring visibility into the invisible markers of health. For example, or a ring or an Apple Watch, it shows us the quantitative data as it relates to our insides to help us make qualitative changes in our lives. But beyond, and you don't even need to purchase one of these wearables, right? Simply just sitting and meditating or doing breath work or enjoying some stillness can be so profound in helping to shift this mindset and to reduce anxiety, so that you can then feel empowered to pursue the knowledge acquisition that you'd like, or to pursue the health, physical fitness that you'd like, and or do really well at your job. So it's critically important. I don't think there's anyone who says like, yeah, I crush it at, maintaining my mental health and things like this. No one ever takes enough time for meditation, myself included.
Yeah.
But it's a tool that's readily available to anyone, which is really powerful.
Yeah. I think, when we talk about changes, I think there's also that aspect of generational change. And, you hear it more and more, and I see it in my own kids, that the Gen Z, Gen Alpha, just completely different focus.
Yep.
And, I guess, first of all, let's just talk about what are the trends you've seen in terms of wealth focus for those generations. And then maybe we can just talk about how that's going to shift so much. Yeah. So
much. You're right. The next generation thinks about wealth entirely differently. And that's the opportunity that exists with this great wealth transfer that's underway. So you have, for those that don't know, the great wealth transfer is basically a great transfer of wealth from one generation to the next. And the new stat as of last month in December was that $105 trillion is going to pass hands from one generation to the next by 2048.
Wow.
$105 trillion. So
that's 10% of global wealth.
Wild.
Yeah.
Absolutely wild.
So that's by what date? Sorry?
2048.
2048. Okay.
Yep.
So we're looking at the next 20 odd years.
Yeah. And that's haircutted even, and that's taking out money that goes to charity. So those are just to the next generation.
Okay.
So you have the next generation who's going to acquire all this financial wealth. But the next generation thinks about financial wealth differently because they're more of a values-oriented generation. What I mean by that is that the next generation wants to make money with values in mind, spend money with values in mind, and also invest money with values in mind. So what are the go-forward implications of that? Well, they're quite profound. Also, the jobs that next gens, and I'm curious, like what your kids want to do when they grow up. It's different, I mean, listen, I got into private banking because I thought that was what I needed to do because that looked like the model of success for me at that point in time. But the optionality, there's so many doors open in terms of how people can make money these days. And it's so fascinating because it also unlocks this ability to step into one's own kind of individual power and to really lean into their interests in a transformative way. I just said a lot right there, but
actually, I'd love to just jump on one bit that you said at the end there, because this is something that comes up a lot with my son. He's 14 years old. We talk a lot about careers and where he should be focused. He's at the point, he goes to school in the UK. He's at the point of choosing his GCSEs, which are the subjects you take when you're 16. So these are like official exam certification that you get at the age of 16 in the UK. And then when you're 18, you do your A-levels.
Okay.
And then the A-levels qualify you to go to university. So he's just at the beginning point of, this decision tree that will see his potential, some formation towards his career. So we do talk about this a lot. But you said something very pertinent, and that is that everything's changing. The job market is opening up completely. And I think a lot of people have a lot of negativity when they think about the job market and AI, for example. Obviously, there are going to be huge shifts on the back of this. Has your work taken you in that direction at all when you work with your clients, thinking about what the child is going to do in a future role and how they should be planning their career now with their choices at school?
It's fascinating. Curious, quickly, what is your son thinking? Is he directionally going finance track, or what's his interests?
At the moment, he's thinking finance track, but that's a 14-year-old boy who's just looking at what his dad does and says, maybe that's something for me.
Of course, that's wonderful. It's a great place to start. We all need to understand finances, personal finances specifically, but yes, like the world is changing quickly. AI included. And I think ultimately AI will help humans to become more human is my thought. That could also be used as leverage, to use a financial term here, which you know better than me, knowing your impressive background and all. And so I think it's just like any tool. right? You can use money as a tool. You can use money for good. You can use money for bad. You can use a hammer for good. You can use a hammer for bad. You can use AI for good. You can use AI for bad. And so I think it's our responsibility as a collective to make sure that we're shepherding this new tool in a productive way. But ultimately, it's going to help take off the table the mundane tasks that no one really wants to do anyways, and kind of outsource that, if you will. And then you become the creator, the manager of the things that you actually want to do or that are interesting to you. There's more optionality for that on a go-forward basis as well. So I think it's, and just as you mentioned earlier, in terms of wealth management, we have technology that helps us a little bit on the investment side, so that it can free up an advisor to then have these kind of qualitative conversations with their clients. So it's just a rejiggering and a reconceptualization of what these roles are with the support of these tools.
Yeah, fascinating. So this must be forming part of the conversation that you're having with clients as well.
It is. And I think too, which is fascinating, is that this great wealth transfer I mentioned, you have one generation that may have made their wealth, I don't know, you said earlier that we're in farming country or something, it's like close by, farming, right? Produce, whatever the case may be. And that's how wealth was created. And the next generation is like, I'm not really that keen to go into farming, and that's okay. So these are the conversations. It's like, how do you identify what your own interests are? What do you want to create in your life? Because ultimately, every person in the world wants to create, right? Richard wants to create something. Jen wants to create something. And it's up to us to identify what that creation is and to honor that creation. And where that becomes an interesting conversation is when you're transferring wealth from one generation to the next, particularly within a family business. So we all kind of have our own experiences with fleshing out exactly what we want to do. And again, it changes over time. And it will change more rapidly in a shorter time frame, I think, going forward, because things are just going to keep on moving quickly and changing quickly. So we'll have to embrace creative adaptability.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, actually, we buy single companies in German-speaking Europe, and the largest proportion of the interesting place we play is that generational change where the kids come in and say, don't want to be involved, sell the business.
Right.
And obviously it's an emotional time for the patriarch or matriarch to be dealing with the handover of the company that's probably been passed down for generations.
Right.
In many cases. Interesting. So if we think about that, just to double click on this massive wealth transfer that you're talking about, where are we seeing trends today? Where are those younger generations thinking about allocation of capital versus their parents' generation?
Yeah, I think that the next generation wants profit and purpose, right? They're focused on value and values. So again, they're honoring both sides of the proverbial coin. They're wanting to embrace this sort of higher octave interpretation of what wealth is. And they want to use their money to help to be part of something bigger. They want to invest in companies or opportunities that are going to help the environment, for example, or, sustainable XYZ, whatever the case is. And also investments that are more personal to them and their interest as well, versus just simply investing in something because you think you're going to get a good return on your investment over a certain timeline. So I think investing is becoming a lot more personal. And again, that's where the values fold into everything, because those values are dictating what people are investing in and why.
It's really interesting because I guess, this whole ESG movement has not been so successful. When you look at the impact funds out there, they generally massively underperform, the businesses that are focused on running a good business, right? And I'm not saying that many ESG companies are not, but when you focus too much on, ticking boxes, you're not necessarily focused on running your business. I guess what you're saying is that has the potential to change quite a lot. Or maybe, and this is something that I really believe very strongly, is that the ESG, those letters potentially need to change. Like putting them all together just doesn't make any sense half the time anyway.
Right.
And maybe they're not the best way to focus an organization's attention. So I think there's work to be done there. But by the sounds of things, environmental certainly seems to be a focus for this group. And therefore that aspect of ESG is probably going to do well in the next 20 years.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I mean, ESG, I think we can kind of scrap that and move on. But I think it served as a productive catalyst to ignite this conversation. It was emblematic of societal shifts that are going on. I think we didn't get it right in terms of ESG and what that means to certain people. And for example, I remember while I was in the Fidelity advisor seat, I mean, people would come to me and say, okay, like what happens if I invest in ESG? What does that even mean? And it's complicated because like, what does that even mean? I don't know. You could invest in Walmart and that could be against ESG because they sell guns, right? So it's just like, how do you slice the conversation, which then again invites this more deeper conversation with clients about like, well, what do you value? Like, what do you want to deploy your capital to and why? So I think from that perspective, it's productive. But I think it's such an individualistic exploration. And again, because of the investment options available and the democratization of wealth, democratization of privates, there's a whole universe open to many people, wherever you fall within the financial wealth spectrum, that you can actually put money behind, that which is most inspiring to you.
Yeah. The more I think about it, this podcast, a lot of what we try and think about is what the future looks like. And so obviously when we think about, whatever it is, boomer, silent generation, moving to Gen X stroke, millennial stroke, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, this is going to be a highly impactful shift. Is there anything else that we need to be thinking about with that shift? Like not just, as you said, monetary wealth, like what else is going to be changing? Because there's that rather scary WEF headline, or I think it's United Nations, I don't know, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, which I think has caused a lot of outrage, rightly so.
Rightly so, yes.
Because it comes with a lot of very dark implications. But, when we think about the various different pillars of wealth for that generation, where are they, not necessarily just from a financial allocation basis, but where are they more focused now? Is it the education piece? You're seeing more in the health, the time, like, are they understanding time? I mean, from my perspective, I look back at my childhood, I spent zero time with my father. Like he just was a completely absent father. And I think as a generation, my parents often say to me, my God, you spend so much time with your kids. Like, it's funny, but like, obviously that is quite a societal shift. And I think that this is definitely something that we're observing. So how else within your principles are we seeing these things change?
Yeah, everything's becoming rejiggered from one generation to the next. And I think technology, again, and societal shifts are helping us to reconceptualize what wealth is and what we're prioritizing and why. So you're prioritizing time with your kids is probably a consequence or benefit of you being able to optimize certain parts of your life by virtue of technology. It's also supported by societal shifts that say like, no, please don't work this amount of hours. That's ridiculous. Like go home and be with your children. So there's a myriad of things that influence the decisions that we make and the things that we're prioritizing and why. In terms of the next generation, I mean, oftentimes what I say about investing, which maps onto every other aspect of this conversation, is that you can't, and you brought it up earlier in terms of mindset, I often say you can't shift money without shifting mindset first. So you need to shift your mindset as it relates to what you're investing in. And so for this part of the conversation, what do you want to invest in and why? Do you want to invest in your family? Is that a priority for you right now? Do you want to invest in your health? Is that a priority for you? You always have to pick something to the exclusion of something else. That's just the nature of the game. And so it's just deciding which game you want to play and why, and what rules you want to play by. And I think everyone has the invitation to examine what game they want to play. Again, in ways that wasn't an option relative to times past. So every individual has an opportunity to lean into their own personal power and to self-actualize in a way that's most fitting for themselves. And that's where you actually find the satisfaction and the richness of life, is to do what you want to do, to go towards what you're compelled to do. And that's what's really exciting for your kids, for example, right? Because they have like, the world is your oyster. And that's the same case for everyone else that's existing right now. We have so much optionality at our hands, and it's only going to get even better.
There's one more generational question I want to ask you, is about education. It's like education is coming up more and more. My daughter has learning difficulties, and so for her, this sort of regimented academic focus structure is very difficult, and it sort of makes her anxious, and it's not great. So I'm always trying to think about how things are likely to change there. Again, with this sort of new view on the future, how are you thinking about education, or how are your clients thinking about education? What are some of these big shifts that you see on the horizon?
It's dynamic, right? Because, well, I think there's a couple forces at our backs which are advantageous for the next generation. So one is that the next generation are digital natives, and they're also increasingly autodidactic, meaning that they're wanting to learn. Self-learning is interesting.
Yeah.
We have tools like YouTube. You have like all of this information at your fingertips to learn literally anything in the world that you want to. And obviously, if you're leaning into things that you want to learn, that's going to be exciting to you more so than learning things that you don't want to learn. So I think the next generation is benefiting from technological advancements and societal shifts in the sense that they have all this information at their fingertips and they can learn on their terms, and then they can use this information and braid it with their own experiences and intuition to create knowledge. And they can take that knowledge and then they can go use that knowledge for productive good. So in terms of education, I think it's becoming much more dynamic and much more personalized, just as investing is becoming more personalized, just as everything in our life is becoming more personalized, which I think is great, right?
Yeah. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Final question I always like to ask a guest on the podcast is, how are you allocating your own financial wealth? What are the things that you see as the opportunity for investment? Obviously, having a very good insight in terms of these generational shifts. Where are you putting your money, Jen?
Well, I became the client that I always hated in the sense that I don't reply to my managed money person. And so it's just kind of relegated to a managed money account. And I have my brokerage account, which I don't really look at or touch. And I also have my Bitcoin allocation too, which I don't touch. So I don't think much about it, to be honest with you, at the moment. But I'm sure there comes a time when I revisit that. So, what about you? I'm curious. You're at the helm, and
Yeah, look, Seize Capital, we're very blessed to have some amazing products. So, I'm an investor in pretty much all our products, I like Bitcoin as well. So I have some of the ETFs, and I have MicroStrategy. I think we've talked about Saylor in previous conversations, but I think what he's doing with MicroStrategy is fantastic.
Agreed. Yeah, really fascinating times and to watch. So Bitcoin and hands off for the financial advisors who are in the seat every single day and know what they're doing, so that I can come have conversations with people like you. So
fantastic.
It all works out.
Thanks for being here, Jen. It was really great.
My pleasure. Thank you.